Hello, it's Marty Braden once again. I'm glad your curiosity for this topic, the celestial programmer of DNA code, got you to click on my video. Thanks for coming. If this is your first time watching one of my videos, before I begin, let me explain quickly what my channel is all about. That way you'll better understand my videos, and I promise you that I'll do my best to make it worth your time. I'm not a professional YouTuber, so keep that in mind, but the information is pretty interesting, I think. The topics of my videos, like this video, are all from the book I wrote, which I titled An Atheist Delusion. It's a Latter-day Saints perspective on Richard Dawkins' anti-theist, anti-Christ book, The God Delusion. Back in 2015, just after I retired, I had an experience that required that I read The God Delusion. I'm sure you recognize his name. Dawkins is a world-renowned atheist and evolutionary biologist who goes around the world trying to get converts to atheism. Anyway, as I was reading his book, I found myself taking a lot of notes, and before I knew it, it had turned into an entire manuscript for a book, which I later titled An Atheist Delusion. After publishing it, I decided to set this YouTube channel up so I could record short videos covering every single argument Mr. Dawkins puts forth in his book in an effort to try and prove God doesn't exist. In fact, Richard said his purpose for writing this book, The God Delusion, was to make atheists out of everyone who reads his book. You see, Mr. Dawkins is in the mindset that all of his arguments against God's existence are extremely probable. Anyway, I searched and searched to find if there were any Latter-day Saints out there who had already responded to Richard's book, but I couldn't find a single Latter-day Saint who had chosen to tackle this rebuttal, and so I decided to bite the bullet and stand up and be counted. So, An Atheist Delusion is my rebuttal to all of Richard's anti-God arguments, which each rebuttal is coming from my perspective, a Latter-day Saints perspective, as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This particular video you're watching right now is part 94 in my series of videos I've recorded so far. So, with that said, let's go ahead and review the next subtitle, which is Tread Softly Because You Tread on My Mean. I'm going to jump right to there. Richard begins this subtitle by repeating his main point, which is Darwinian natural selection abhors waste. And so any ubiquitous feature of a species, such as religion, that's what he's saying it is, a feature of a man's mindless imagination must have conferred some advantage to its survival, or it wouldn't have survived. This is a rule of evolution and of natural selection that has to be followed for it to really fit under the title of natural selection. Richard then says such advantages can even be replicators, such as viruses and memes, which are units of cultural inheritance. These are the topics of this subtitle, he says. Could this possibly be a divine inheritance, Richard? A trait of divinity in us that's replicating within this house? I don't know. You give that some thought. Richard continues, to understand memes, which means to imitate and replicate, we have to first look a little more carefully at exactly how natural selection works. In its most general form, Richard says, natural selection must choose between alternative replicators. A replicator is a piece of coded information. That's how he defines it, a piece of coded information that makes exact copies of itself. Thus, to imitate, along with inexact copies or mutations. In this line of thinking, making religious information biologically coded information, Richard, get ready for Richard's slide of the words once again here. Any ubiquitous feature of a species is how Richard's defining this. A ubiquitous feature of a species. Really, the idea of an intention coming from a mind, such as religion, being a coded feature of a species or a replicator like a virus or meme is highly improbable. To me, it's unbelievable. I apologize if I sound like a broken record here, but isn't Richard actually referring to the coded information that has been found in DNA? Is that the feature? Is that the meme? Richard seems to be saying that the choosing to keep or the choosing to let go of any feature that confers advantages is being done by natural selection and not the DNA's chemical code and directions within that. How does this concept have the information to do its thinking and deciding regarding these so-called features, Richard? He's saying that the directives aren't coming by way of DNA's informational instructions that's already coded in each and every cell. Yet science says that the DNA does the directing within each cell. period. To me, it sounds like Richard's hijacking DNA's directive power by just simply renaming it natural selection, describing it as a feature manager. For him, natural selection is doing the keeping or discarding of the so-called advantages or disadvantages of certain features at the cellular level. Or in other words, it sees the cell's makeup and decides to keep or reject parts of it. So it's not the DNA doing this directing. My goodness. Richard is saying that it's natural selection that sets in motion the replication process and not DNA's coding. Richard is saying that the power of natural selection is some kind of gene managing force within the cells themselves. Yeah, versus what science has been saying for years, which is that it's the DNA code. That's the gene managing force directing what goes on within the walls of that cell. I ask Richard, and I ask you, consider this, who or what put this natural selection directing force and power, along with its code information, into the cells in the first place? DNA's coding is what directs all of the cell's protein forming functions. It tells the particles within the cells to do what they do to form each needed protein. And they do what they're supposed to do, all within the bounds that were set in the first place. There's laws written in each cell. In other words, that 16th, 17th century scientists, when they first started, they were religious and they knew that there was a lawgiver and that out in the universe and all the way down in the tiny cells, there were laws written and given in each cell. From their beginning, it's the creator designers, or one might call it the celestial coders program. God's celestial program. He's the celestial programmer. I ask, where does such information, there's the key word there, where does such information and coded directions come from that are in these cells? The species, the feature, the replicator, the mean? A watch does not come up with the mechanism for telling time, right? It is the DNA coding information in the cell that is the directing force causing the particular particles within the cell to form the proteins. It's the coding information that builds these features and replicators. It's the mind and spirit of God that placed the life-giving creative force in each cell. This information has the book of life written on every single cell in existence. God and God's mind alone is the celestial coding programmer, so to speak. God's mind is the source of life throughout the world and the entire universe. He and his programming, his coding, is the theory of everything. It's not some wet brains, unguided, unintended, mindless firing off of neurons here and around, bouncing around, that generates these features or replicators that popped into existence out of nothing. The brain doesn't come up out of nothing with information. The evidence shows that strands of DNA are in fact the information laden within DNA's chemical alphabet, represented by the letters A, T, C, and G. A single DNA molecule, for example, stores over 215 million gigabytes of information in it. And we all know, or at least we should know, that all information flows from a mind. The DNA in the cells is where the how-to information directing the replicating system is found. This DNA directing information codes source the mind of God. That's the source, is the mind of God. Richard, on the other hand, believes there's no such thing as a mind or a God, and men's wet brain, their wet brain alone, with the help of natural selection, generates the information needed to direct the mindless, unguided, undirected brain activity, but only after life begins. Okay, that's part of an atheist delusion, is how I see it. To me, Richard seems to be saying that natural selection's directing power lies dormant in the DNA alphabet code letters themselves, in the chemicals A, T, C, and G, and as such, they can only be activated after life begins. The incredible alphabet-laced strands of DNA code somehow knows when to activate its power so it can start directing the cell's creation of molecules activities, but only when life itself has been activated in the cell cluster. Richard says, once life is there in the cell, natural selection takes over. Come on, man. This is truly an atheist delusion for sure, for he has absolutely no proof of it being so. Otherwise, show us how to give life to these parent cells, Richard, so that you can say that God and his knowledge is unnecessary. His information is unnecessary. Also explain to me how the word selection is defined so that an agent isn't necessary for making the preferred selections. Here is a definition from the Oxford Dictionary for selection. It says, the action or fact of carefully choosing someone or something as being the best or most suitable. This requires evaluation, a principle of thought, and an agent to choose the best. That's natural selection? An unguided, unintended, informationless firing off of an accidental explosion and bouncing just in a certain way and bring the brain information that's 4 billion letters long. Now add this power to carefully choose or select in the biological sense of the word. Richard is saying that natural selection is the force by which biological, environmental, and genetic influencers are the agents that's determining which types of organisms thrive better than others, and is therefore regarded as the main factor or feature in the evolution of religion. Good grief! Words like selecting, choosing, evaluating, determining, influencing, influences, or influencers all seem to require the power of an agent's mind that does something with the information versus a concept itself doing the directing and the coding or the selecting. Where did the information contained in these cells come from, Richard? If you are going to produce the informational instructions needed to initiate an action or a process to be performed, like DNA forming proteins, coded information is absolutely necessary, much like programs are needed for a computer to start computing. It is the source of the directions. The DNA's programming. It's the programming that initiates the action to form the proteins. The power or energy of life, combined with the information found in each and every cell of the body, it's that directs cells to do what they do. Both are put there by an agent, even the agent I'm calling God, who is the source of all this information, knowledge. Evolution didn't put it there. Evolution is just a concept or a process. Both the power of life and the information to direct it were put in each and every cell at their beginning. Their organizing, their activation, and these forces are placed there by God, as I said, who is the source of all life. I liken this relationship to the hardware we call a computer. It requires a word processor and operating system, its mind, as well as its software programs, its intelligence or DNA information, for example, to do all its computing, living and thinking. It also needs power of electricity pumped into it before it can do any computing. It's life power. The same is true of our brains. They require a mind, the intelligence or operating software program, so to speak, its directions, so that the body can turn on and operate, and electricity is its life force. The Spirit of God, putting that spirit, our spirits, into our bodies is the power of life force in us. The brain's mind is actually the mind of the spirit personage who resides within each of our bodies, which breathes life into it. Our spirit is our operating system living within our body. Our spirit, our inner self, gives our brain, the hardware, its power to turn on and operate and function, think, dream, and do all that it does. Like I said earlier, I feel like Richard is trying to hijack the process and directing force that's called DNA and that it performs by simply renaming it natural selection. Does it have its own chemical coding, alphabet letters forming the instructions it uses to direct the cell's activity, Richard? How is this force coming up with it and then telling the DNA what to do with it? Richard continues, the point about this is the Darwinian one. Those varieties of replicators, a replicator being a coded DNA information string, that happened to be good at getting copied, cells being directed to copy themselves, self-replicating cells, become more numerous as the expense of alternative replicators that are bad at getting copied. That, at its most rudimentary level, is natural selection, Richard says. Listen to what Richard just said. The power behind the cell's ability to copy itself is natural selection. Natural selection's process is now the force that selects and organizes and copies. Really, Richard? I think a whole lot of scientists would beg to differ with that. He continues, quote, the archetypal replicator is a gene, a stretch of DNA. There it is. Richard finally admits it. He just said it. It's the DNA or a stretch of DNA that is duplicated, nearly always with extreme accuracy, he says, through an indefinite number of generations. But I would say, Richard, by what means, Richard? How is it doing this? The central question for meme theory, he says, is whether there are units of cultural limitation which behave as true replicators like genes. And the purpose of this section is to ask cultural limitations, is to ask whether meme theory, imitating inheritance, in other words, might work for the species or the special case of religion. It is not obviously silly to speak of a meme pool in which particular memes might have a frequency which can change as a consequence of competitive interactions with alternative memes. The exact physical nature of a gene is now known. It is the sequence of DNA he's talking about, whereas that of memes is not. And different memetistics confuse one another by switching from one physical medium to another. End quote. Good grief. I don't know about you, but to me, the last few statements that Richard just made are saying that a meme's nature is not known, which is simply saying that replicators in the memes that have the so-called feature of religion in them either stay in one physical medium or they switch to another one, but we just don't know why. If this isn't a guess, then I don't know what guessing is, because he's just guessing here. Now, does that sound logical to you? Think about what he just said. It sure doesn't seem logical to me. It is, in my humble opinion, science speak. And it's hogwash. Excuse me. Here's even more science speak. Richard goes on to explain meme pools and memeplexes in order to introduce his memetic theory of religion. Richard says, quote, some religious ideas, like some genes, might survive because of absolute merit. These memes would survive in any meme pool, regardless of the other memes that surround them. Some religious ideas survive because they are compatible with other memes that are already numerous in the meme pool, as part of a memeplex, which is called survival value. Wow, survival value is all that? Come on, Richard. Where's the scientific method behind all of this? What testing have you done with it? This is intellectual puffery and bloviating on something you don't have a clue to how it truly is happening. Richard reveals his biased opinion, once again, regarding faith itself, which is that it's simply blind, meaning a belief backed up with no evidence. In other words, scientific evidence in particular. He sarcastically says, quote, faith is a virtue. The more your beliefs defy the evidence, the more virtuous you are, end quote. Of course, this is saying that people of faith are people who live by blind faith, for they have no scientific evidence to back up their claims about the existence of God. This obviously comes down to how one defines evidence, of course. At least that's what I believe. Here's what the Apostle Paul wrote in the book of Hebrews, wherein he spoke on the principle of faith and evidence and their definition. Hebrews 11 verse 1 says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, and the evidence of things not seen. A good analogy, I feel it's a good analogy anyway, but you'll be the judge. A good analogy of this kind of faith is a sailboat clipping along in a lake with its sails billowing. In this analogy, the substance of the things hoped for is the hope that the boat's sail will fill with air. That's the hope, thus allowing the sailboat to move forward. The evidence of things not seen is the boat's sail actually filling up with the unseen power of wind and air, making the sailboat clip along by its billowing sails technology. The unseen thing, of course, is the wind. This unseen power of the wind is making the sailboat move in the water, which is evidence. It also causes the water to split against its bow, coming on both sides, which is additional evidence. But this evidence is the effect evidence of things unseen, not seeing the wind, but the effects, you see it. In other words, there are two types of evidence in this example, the seen and the unseen evidence. Both are very real evidence and do in fact exist for those who have eyes to see it. Have you seen a sailboat go by? Both literally and spiritually. Like I said, it's obvious that Richard, though though intelligent, is not schooled enough in his understanding of religious principles, or what's called the mysteries of godliness, and their eternal laws that they're predicated upon. And therefore he seems to be unable to see the forest for the trees. Faith, hope, charity, and pure religion. These are the things of the Spirit, even the mysteries of godliness. They all seem to be terms of which Richard has very little, if any, experience with or understanding of. Just like he accuses most theists, like myself, of having very little understanding of evolution's favorite tenet, natural selection. Anyway, even though I felt it important to bring your attention to this illustration of the sailboat, it being a good metaphor of how the principle of faith works, I have gotten off script here, so I won't repeat the entirety of the next paragraph Richard quotes, but I do want to share the part where it says, quote, "Given this background, mimic natural selection of some kind seems to me to offer a plausible account of the detailed evolution of particular religions in the early stages of religion's evolution, before it becomes organized, simply means surviving by virtue of their universal appeal to human psychology." End quote. This is just saying that people get or come up with ideas of their own and then get excited enough to go and recruit others to join them, creating an organized religion, right? Is that what Richard's saying? Next, Richard gives a couple examples to suggest the plausibility that religion can be and was intelligently designed. The examples Richard gives are Scientology and Mormonism. Let me share what is supposed to be an objective view of his mimetic theory. However, it's a completely biased, derogatory opinion of Mormonism, and I should know. I'm one of them. Here's what Richard said about it. Quote, "Another candidate for a purely designed mimetic religion is Mormonism. Joseph Smith, its enterprisingly mendacious, meaning lying inventor, who went to the lengths of composing a complete new holy book. He composed this new holy book, he's saying, the Book of Mormon, inventing from scratch a whole new bogus American history, written in bogus 17th century English. Mormonism, however, has evolved since it was fabricated in the 19th century and has now become one of the respectable mainstream religions of America, indeed." End quote. Another description of Mormonism was given by John Krakauer back in 2003. Mr. Krakauer is the author of Under the Banner of Heaven. John said, "Joseph Smith lived out his days on stage, so to speak, for all to observe. As the angel Moroni declared to Joseph, 'Your name will be had for good and evil among all nations, kindreds, tongues, and people, some criticizing and some venerating.' Joseph Smith was God's conduit for bringing back bold doctrines concerning the nature of God, the nature of man, the nature of human experience, the purpose of life, and even the nature of the universe." I guess there must be something wrong with me here as a Latter-day Saint, because I should be offended by Richard's lambasting my religious faith and its prophet founder Joseph Smith. But I'm not, and here's why I'm not. Richard once again reveals his true colors, and to me it's laughable. Let me explain myself as I go through this. In his criticism, Richard shows his unscientific bias towards Mormonism. Richard's constantly setting aside the scientific method by simply expressing the alternative, subjective, philosophical, and often biased hatred towards the religious. In other words, Richard didn't do any kind of in-depth research that he should have done before making such uninformed criticisms as though they're tested fact. Let me say that I don't mind his criticism. I really don't. I just think Richard should have lived up to what he preaches, and which is research, predictions, experiments, comparisons, all forming the scientific method. He did none of these. Richard used words like mendacious, which means lying, like I said, not telling the truth, inventor, bogus, and fabricated. This doesn't sound like the fruit of the scientific method gained from a series of predictions while doing rigorous testing to find out if such and such truth claims are truthful or fabricated, founded, or made up historicity. Richard's criticisms are simply Richard's opinions stuffed with bigoted mockery. That's my view. Richard's views flow from his overall bias against religion, his atheism as a whole. And so I grant Richard the license to give his opinion about my faith. I really do. But what I don't do is I don't give him a license to create his own facts about it. Since I don't want to make my perspective of Richard's book to be just about me or about my faith alone, let me reply to Richard's criticism here by referring you to a book titled A Marvelous Work and a Wonder, written by Richard's LeGrand Richard, he's an apostle from 1952 to 1983, excuse me, and a past member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm suggesting this book as an alternative to reading the 6-volume comprehensive history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which would be one of the better sources for learning the actual history of so-called Mormonism, as opposed to Richard's biased, prejudiced account. In my opinion, I think Elder Richard's work will do a wonderful job of informing you about my church. It's a fair and balanced history of the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ and of Joseph Smith Jr. as the prophet founder and first president and prophet of the restored church in this, the last dispensation of the fullness of times. It's a quick read. It's a book about like that. It's a quick read versus you having to read a voluminous 6-volume history. If after reading the marvelous work and the wonder, you find yourself agreeing with Mr. Dawkins' assessment of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its beginnings, then that's just fine with me. It just seems fair and balanced if both perspectives are represented here, and not just Richard's highly charged, highly biased, uninformed slam of my faith. I prefer you refer to me as a disciple of Jesus Christ, or of just simply a Latter-day Saint and not a Mormon or Mormonism. That way you can determine for yourself whether or not my faith is deceitful, fabricated, invented, bogus, man-made religion set up by a fraudulent con man, or if it's what I say it is, the restored gospel of Jesus Christ with Latter-day prophets and apostles being its foundation. Jesus himself told Peter he would build his church upon this rock, the rock being and his revelation being himself and his revelation to his prophet apostles, and that his apostles and prophets like Peter, James, and John and the others were necessary until we're unified in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God, that we henceforth be no more children tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine, with every interpretation under the moon, in other words. Ephesians 4:11 through 15 says, and he gave some apostles and some prophets and some evangelists. Evangelist is like a patriarch. I know modern day interpretation is different, but it's like in our faith it's a patriarch that gives patriarchal blessings. An evangelist, Joseph Smith taught that an evangelist, like I said, is a patriarch in Doctrine and Covenants 107, 39 through 53. And then it goes on and says, and some pastors and teachers. Pastors in the LDS faith is a bishop or a branch president that deals with shepherding a small group of 100 or less all the way up to 600 to 1,000 in a ward. And teachers, deacons, and so forth. Verse 12, for the perfecting of the saints. That's why we have us, the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come to a unity of the faith. Have we come to a unity of the faith? Absolutely not. And of the knowledge of the Son of God, a unified understanding of this knowledge of the Son of God. Are you there? No. Unto a perfect man, a complete man, unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Have you become and reached the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ? Verse 14, that we henceforth be no more children tossed to and fro, like I said, and carried about with every mind or wind of doctrine by the sleight of men and cunning craftiness, whereby they lie in wait to deceive. Richard, regarding Richard's meme theory, Richard says, whatever theory of religious evolution we adopt, it has to be capable of explaining the astonishing speed with which the process of religious evolution, given the right conditions, can take off. Excuse me. Man, this sure sounds like Richard still has no idea as to how and why religion sprang up immediately and did so ubiquitously. Didn't Richard say Mormonism evolved starting with its beginnings in 1830? That's just 192 years ago, right? When I consider Richard's answer to religion's origin, I have to ask, why has the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had such meteoric, that's what it said. I gotta get my glasses fixed here. Such a meteoric rise since its beginnings in 1830. I ask this because the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints grew to more than 17 million members almost overnight. In fact, a recent report by CBN.com said that Mormonism, using that word again, is the fastest growing faith in American history. The CBN.com article reported that if present trends continue, there could be 265 million members of the Church of Jesus Christ worldwide by the year 2080. That's only a 250-year growth period compared to the thousands of years that the three other Abrahamic faiths have had, and the centuries that modern Christianity has been evolving since its inception in the 1st century. Evangelical Christianity began with Wesley in the 18th century and the Reformation in the 16th century. Christianity has had a tumultuous existence ever since that 1st century. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints certainly has taken off. This kind of meteoric rise or growth for an evolution mimic mutated religion almost defies the theory itself, doesn't it? It's been less than 200 years and not the millions of years that Richard's mimetic theory of religion's origin by evolution theory requires. I wonder why it has grown so fast in such a short period of time, don't you? Could it be because the LDS Church is true and has changed the minds and hearts of millions, tens of millions, and women worldwide? If I understand evolution correctly, for any kind of evolution to work, it takes millions of years, right? At least that's what evolutionists like Richard Dawkins would have us believe. The restored Church of Jesus Christ sprang forth almost instantaneously from its start in 1830, as I said, right after God and Jesus spoke to their boy prophet, Joseph Smith Jr. Their visitation to their chosen oracle was foretold by ancient prophets who were allowed to peer around the corner, so to speak, and see into these the latter days as God foretold they would. Anyway, I'll cover this more thoroughly in a later chapter in the future, but I'm going to close this off. The next subtitle is Cargo Cults. That's a very fascinating theory of Richard that we'll cover. So until next time, I want you to write your comments. I'll answer any questions you ask. I look forward to getting to it as quickly as I can. But until next time, I truly do want to wish you continued success. Goodbye.